Hi, welcome to Engineering 160A, Studio Session 3.4, Control and Indicator Clusters. The tutorial objective is we're going to discuss the use of clusters to improve the end user experience, both in the front panel operation and the readability of the block diagram. Here we are at the front panel of our waveform simulator VI. When we look at our front panel, we see we have 5 controls on the left side. The first two, number of samples and sampling frequency, control how our generated signal is being sampled, while the other 3 control the generated waveform signal itself, frequency, amplitude, and shape. Wouldn't it be nice if we could group the digitization parameters and the waveform parameters with themselves? LabVIEW allows us to do this with clusters. Let's right-click on the front panel. Under Modern, we can go to Array, Matrix, and Cluster, and then we can grab a cluster shell. Can drag and drop that onto my front panel, and I'm going to change that name cluster to digitization parameters. I'm going to grab a second one, and this will be my waveform parameters. Now that I have my 2 clusters set up, let me start to input my number of samples and my sampling frequency into that digitization parameter box such that these are now grouped together. So all I need to do is hover over them and drag and drop them into the cluster. And if I want, I can resize and straighten them out. I can also hover over the border of my cluster, right click, go down to auto sizing and do size to fit, and then my cluster will look a bit neater. So let me do the same thing for my waveform parameters. I'm going to drag in the frequency, the amplitude, and let me grab shape. Right click on the border, auto sizing, size to fit. And I will line them up and evenly distribute them. Let me bring them all to the left side, and let me even line up the 2 clusters together. And I'll drag them closer to my graph. Let me also create a third cluster for my output, and both T and X are the time and the amplitude of the waveform itself. So those are the outputted waveform. So let me go to cluster again, and let me call this waveform output. And I will drag in the time and the amplitude. Resize to fit, and there, now we have all of my controls and indicators grouped nicely with clusters. What we'll notice is just by clustering these things together, we have an error created in our VI. So where are these errors coming from? We'll need to take a look at our block diagram. Back in our block diagram, we can see that our errors are associated with a bunch of broken wires. So let me hit Control and B to clear out all those broken wires. And the reason for those broken wires, of course, is we have grouped our controls together. Here we have digitization parameters, and we no longer have our number of samples and our sampling frequency separated. They are bundled together, and also our waveform parameters. In addition, we see we have our waveform output. Well, how do we fix this? Well, our parameters are bundled together. We need to unbundle them and separate them. So let's right click, and we'll go to Cluster, Class, and Variant. And here we have Unbundle by Name. So let me click that and drag that, drop it down, and hook up my digitization parameters to it. And now we see that first one is number of samples, and that is listed that way because it's the first control that I dropped in. And let me do the same thing for my waveform parameters. Right click, Cluster, Class, Array, Unbundle by Name, and hook that up and drag down 3 to see all of the different parameters. Now I have my number of samples again, and I can hook that back up to N, my number of samples. My sampling frequency, hook back up to F_S. Frequency, amplitude, and lastly that shape parameter. Finally, we have our waveform output cluster. Luckily for us, our parameters or our outputs, the time and the amplitude, are already bundled together because a bundle was needed for our XY graph. So all we need to do is take that bundled data and bring it to my waveform output. With this setup, we can see that our block diagram is much more readable for a user. When we return to our front panel, we can see that when we run the program, it works exactly as we had expected, as it did previously. Another nice feature, LabVIEW allows us to save these clusters such that we can use these pre-packaged controls in future programs. To do that, make sure your program is not running. Right-click on the border of your cluster, go down to Advanced, and go to Customize. This will bring up another window which looks very much similar to a VI. These are control parameters, so I'll make sure that control here is checked and not type definition or strict type definition. Then I'll go down to File and Save. I'll save this where I have my VI. You can see here it's called control1.ctl. I'll change that to be called digitization parameters. Digitization underscore parameters. And then I'll hit OK. I can close that, and then I'll do the same thing for my waveform parameters. Right click, Advanced, Customize, it's Control, File, Save, and I will call this waveform parameters. Close that, and lastly I'll do it for my waveform output. Right click, Advanced, Customize, and save waveform output. Okay. Close that. Now that we have them saved, we can see the advantage of this. If I wanted to, let's say I was creating a different program, or I wanted a different set of my waveform parameters because I was creating a second one. Now all I have to do is go to File and then Open. I can locate my waveform parameters, hit OK to open it, and now all I need to do is come up here, take this icon, drag it onto my VI, and you see I have my prepackaged waveform parameters that I can utilize as needed. This concludes our discussion on clusters.